Hello, my name is Amanda Achtman, and I'm here with my dear friend, Hanna Zack Miley. Both of us are Jewish and Christian, and so I wanted to ask you, Hanna, how do you hold together these two identities of being Jewish and Christian?
I hold them together with difficulty and with years of learning how to do that, and I'm still on the journey of doing it. But today, I think it's a very exciting tension and very actually fulfilling.
So many people have different and seemingly disparate identities that they try to hold together. What advice do you have for someone who seems to live this tension on how to live it with meaning and not just tragedy?
You know, actually, this is so true because today I'm just meeting all these people who have developed identity through a lot of fragmentation and change. So I like your question, how do I do it? I think basically holding it together, I have to have an inner security. And I think my innermost security, the kind of whole foundation of being and living in the tension of not quite belonging, is I'm a child of God. And I don't mean that like in a trite way, child of God. It's an actual experience of having God as a father who gives me a place. He created me to be in this Jew, Christian, German, English, American, this melting pot. But at the core of it, there's this stability, this identity. I belong to Him.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. When you were just 7 years old, you were sent on the Kindertransport, and you were uprooted from your hometown, and you were separated from your parents. And then, as a child, throughout your upbringing, you needed to forge a new identity, having been so uprooted. How did you do that?
Well, when I was 7, I took on the identity of an English schoolchild. And that is the direct opposite to being a Jewish, very cared for, intimate, emotional, secure home with parents. And I was not only English, but I had lost all that foundation. So I did it by swallowing who I was and kind of breaking free from who my identity as a Jewish child, a refugee, into trying to conform to the customs and the identity of an English child, which actually in England at that time was very much suck it up and have a stiff upper lip.
And what were the benefits and what were the negatives of that kind of approach to the situation?
The benefits were that to a measure I was accepted in the society. And at that time, of course, it wasn't just a British German Jew, it was also enemies. Germany was the enemy, Britain was the enemy. And so I was fitting in to a somewhat safe place. That was externally. I managed to live and to be educated in that environment. But internally, it brought a lot of turmoil. Because I think until we're really comfortable with who we are, then we're kind of lost souls wandering in a wilderness. And that's the way I would describe myself.
In Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks's recent book, he has a chapter about victimhood, and he speaks about Holocaust survivors as being somewhat preeminent among victims, and yet many of the survivors who he's met, he describes as not having a mentality of victimhood, even while having been legitimately victims. So you too have spoken about this. How do you think it's possible to be a victim and in touch with your story and the grief and the trauma of that while not harboring a victimhood mindset?
You know, that those two things that you've stated about knowing the reality that you actually were a victim, that great injustice was done to your parents and to you, great evil, and yet not being buried by that like a heavy weight. How can you be free of that? That's a huge question. How to be released and yet not deny it, not be in denial, face it and come through it. I mean, would you like to hear the story of how there was actually an event that I remember very vividly that freed me from that? Well, we were invited, my husband and I, to a very beautiful hotel in Germany. And gathered together were Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, and Germans, and us too, my husband and I. And the leader who had convened this collection of people talked to us about Germany's sense of victimhood, which, I mean, to American or British ears, that's a bit strange, but actually, at that time, maybe 20 years ago, Germany really still bore the sense of victimhood of their the consequences of Hitler, and they felt victims. They also felt the victimhood of the destruction of their country, and they also felt the victimhood of the shame of their ancestors. They bore the shame of their ancestors. So he talked about that. And then he talked about how could we get rid of this debilitating mindset. And he did something kind of unusual. He put a rope across the room like a river. And he asked all of us to stand on one side of the rope. And he said, actually, you know, we Germans feel we're victims, but, you know, Palestinians carry a lot of sense of being unjustly treated. And they are the victims of the history of the past. And also, Jews who are here have their stories of injustice. And then he invited those who wanted to say goodbye to their victimhood, to turn their backs to it, and to step over like a river into a place of freedom, to bring all that sense of injustice and pain and suffering to Jesus, who actually is the bearer of all pain. When he died there, hung, he took our sorrows and our wounds, give them to him and be free. And you know, when I look back, this is a number of years ago, it is still fresh today. I was physically, spiritually, emotionally released from this sense of bondage to the past. And afterwards, we got into little groups and we shared and we prayed. And I was with two German men. And I came in that prayer time, it was like a flash going back to the time when I was a 7-year-old child sitting in the railway carriage, being carried away from my parents and all that was familiar. And I took on the role of victim. I shut down. That was the moment. And now this, so many years later, when I stepped over that river and brought everything to Jesus, that was the moment of my release. And, you know, I can't tell you the freedom and the blessing, and it changed my life.
Hanna, whenever I see the news of an anti-Semitic incident or attack, I think about Holocaust survivors, and I think about what it must be like to see this so many years after the Holocaust. What is it like for you when you hear news of anti-Semitic attacks and incidents in our world today?
Actually, that's quite a deep question, and how can I answer that just in kind of a minute? I don't know, because it's that question, you see, puts me in touch with what was it like to go to Chelmno and to actually stand in the place where my parents went into the gas van. And what is it like to watch the film Shoah and have one of the handful of survivors from the Chelmno extermination place recount his experiences, because it takes me directly in confronting this profound darkness and evil. I mean, I just feel that these anti-Semitic incidents, even seeing the swastikas on a Jewish gravestone, apart from like killings in synagogues, like in America, in Poway, because it's the same confrontation of this darkness and evil and injustice. And, it takes me back to my struggle in forgiving. And it returns you to a deeper level of forgiveness. And, I'm thinking, this is kind of a very dramatic incidence of darkness and light. It's evil incarnate. You see it. But aren't we all living in great evil? Like today here, the COVID in plague is rising up in a new form. And then we have lots of denial and antagonism about that. So it has the same smell to it for me. And so it's very painful, in simple words. It's painful to hear anti-Semitism. And then you can go through that sense of fear. What is this going to lead to? Because, another thing that faces me is the fact that in the Holocaust in Germany, there were so many signs when you look back of what would happen. Why we were not aware of it? Why didn't my parents escape? So all it's why, and what does it mean, and how can I bear this pain? The bottom line is I have to again go back to bringing those things I don't understand, the things I struggle with, to Jesus, to God, and to believe that God is just. And somehow I feel it's all bound up with God giving us the freedom to choose. In order for us to choose God freely, he has to give us free will. And right from the beginning of history, the beginning of time, some chose to do evil, and it's continuing. And I marvel at the patience of God, and I ask him for grace to deal with it.
Wow. What would you say to Christians who desire to show solidarity with the Jewish community, in particular with reference to Holocaust education?
I think Christians who want to really go into what this means and how should they react, it's almost part of the package of being a Christian who is able to look honestly at what's happening and lay down our prejudices and our preconceptions and be very open yourself. How does it affect me? Be careful about sentimentalizing it, be careful of making that your kind of burden that you bear to tell other people about it, but enter into it with God's viewpoint on it, and become aware, read the books. Actually, look at the headlines from reputable sources. I would say be realistic and find out what your part is. Be very open to looking into it, studying it, and then see where you can be a person of truth and light.
Hannah, so often in our lives, we seek to discern God's providence throughout the course of our lives, but things seem rather meandering, and sometimes life even seems interrupted. Your life was interrupted in a lot of ways. How do you see God's providence in all the disruptions and chaos of life?
When I was a child without kind of the capacity to understand what was going on, I can remember lying in bed at night in Coventry, England, and saying in the darkness, God, why me? Why me? And, when your life is interrupted, you have this sense of being alone. You're really into digging in to your story and your losses and the injustice and the pain. And it is only now, after this long journey into the healing of that and discovering my identity and still discovering it, I'm realizing that I am actually part of a vast multitude. And, being a Jew, I think about the stories of my ancestors. And, preeminently, Abraham was a person who left his country and he wandered. And, Moses, look at Moses. He was born into a Jewish family at a time when they were killing the babies. And he was brought up as an Egyptian. And then because he murdered and tried to right injustice with his own hands, he went off to Midian, another country, and he was brought from Midian to wander all the way, and then he didn't even get into Israel. And then think of Esther. She lost her parents, and she was selected to be one of the many wives of the ruler, foreign ruler. What a horrible, horrible story, And then you think of Paul, the Apostle Paul. He spent his whole life wandering, and he also had this identity change and being pulled out of being respected and a leader in the Jewish community to being let down in a basket and stoned and in prison. So actually, the idea that we stay in our little cottage with a white picket fence and we live there all our lives and the sun is shining and the birds are singing, that is a bit of an illusion, and we all kind of want it and we all feel that's the right way. But really, the question is, how can we live in our disruptions? Is there a place where you can feel secure and feel blessing? Because, instead of deprivation and kind of anger against how life has treated us, is there a place of gratitude and peace and abundance? Can you find abundance in that? And again, I found it in Jesus. And I would say this is not like a perfect stream of blessing. There are daily hardships and everything, but this is my lodestar. This is where I come back to. This is my place where I can go.
Thank you for that. Hannah, tell me about a moment of forgiveness and reconciliation that was pivotal for you?
It's interesting how you word that, Amanda. That moment was pivotal for me. I think I would describe it as, in these last years of my life, it's though God is the arranger of these things. Because thinking back to the event when that happened, it happened in Bonn, the city of my birth, I can only see it as God making the arrangement. It was not a good idea that I had. It came out of the blue. I was invited to take part with other Germans in a kind of walk through the city of Bonn, visiting all the Jewish places where there had been Jewish institutions, shops, the synagogue, and families, and remembering what had been and honoring their memory. And at this event, we ended up in the marketplace in Bonn, in front of this very beautiful town hall. And we were standing on cobbles. It was pouring with rain, and the German people who had marched with us all had umbrellas. And I marvel at the German capacity to operate in the rain. It actually doesn't matter. Everything goes on. So we had this little plastic shelter for the speakers, and they arranged chairs under this little plastic shelter. And I was sitting there on this little rickety chair, and they had a microphone, and not part of the program, quite unexpectedly, this tall German businessman walked up to the microphone. This happened after I had read from my book. They asked me to read from my story, my book. In German, it's Meine Krone in der Asche, my crown in the ashes. And I thought, what should I read when I was selecting the passages before that day? And this makes me think God set it up. That day was actually anniversary of my parents' death in Chumno. It was the day they stepped into the gas van and were asphyxiated in Chumno, Poland. So I thought, I have to read about that event because I want to honor my parents on this day, and that's why I'm supposed to be here, to honor them. So I read in my broken German the description of what happened on that day. And I felt totally drained after doing it. The fact that it was that day, this was the place, the city where I was born, and they were facing me, all these Germans, experiencing great sorrow and identifying as they heard what had happened. So I sat down on the chair, and this tall German, went up to the microphone, unplanned, and he said, Hannah, my grandfather was a Nazi. My grandfather was a Nazi until the day he died. And he never could say these words, and I want to say the words that he could never say. Will you forgive me? Now, connected with that request for forgiveness was his grandfather was in Chumno as an SS officer on the day my parents perished. It was only a small group of Nazis that were arranging all this. And what was I to do? How could I react? Isn't it? The man's name was Marcus, and Marcus is my father's name. So it's almost like I knew that God had arranged this, and that made it possible to bridge this huge gap. I sat there in the chair, and it was almost like I felt I was pulled out of the chair. It wasn't like I dashed towards him. It was like I was lifted out of the chair and I walked towards him and we embraced. And I said, Marcus, I forgive you. And two things went on. First of all, I could almost see that this shame, this darkness in his past, it was like God was lifting it. But also, the Lord was doing this healing. He was putting balm on my soul about my parents. And the whole thing, it wasn't like two human beings doing the reconciliation thing. This was something supernatural. It was something not of human doing. You know, the very fact that it was the day my parents died, we were in the city where I was born. I read from the book, Marcus came. And that's how God is. I mean, I say, God, heal our world, bring forgiveness, reconciliation to these wounds that we're all living in.
Wow, that's extraordinary. What a story. Thanks, Anna.